The smoke had finally cleared enough for Jake Mitchell to see the devastation. 40,000 acres of Flathead National Forest reduced to ash and skeletal trees that reached toward a sky still hazy with the memory of flames.
Please, Ember.
He had been fighting this fire for 17 days straight, and his body screamed for rest with every step through the smoldering remains. But something caught his eye in the gray wasteland ahead.
We pulled him out of the
a small shape that did not belong among the charred logs and blackened dirt.
Oxygen and fluid
As Jake moved closer, his heart dropped into his stomach. It was a bobcat kitten, no more than 8 weeks old, lying motionless beside what had once been a fallen tree. Around the tiny animal, scattered in a horrific circle, were the bodies of its mother and 3 siblings. They had not made it out. The kitten should not have survived either.
Okay now,
Yet as
Ember.
Jake knelt down in the ash, he saw the shallow rise and fall of its small
forest
chest.
is waiting for you,
The
Ember.
animal was
The
alive,
sun warms
but
the
barely,
soft moss and the
its
wind
mouth
whispers
hanging
through the tall
open as it
trees.
struggled to
It's
pull
green
air
and
into
alive
lungs
out there.
ravaged by toxic
Hey there,
smoke.
Ember.
Jake
You're
knew the
doing
protocol.
so well.
He was
We're
supposed
just
to
gonna take a
radio
look,
for
okay?
wildlife services and move on. There were still hot spots to monitor, perimeters to secure, and his team was counting on him. But as he looked down at this impossibly small creature fighting for every breath, something inside him broke. He had seen too much death in these 17 days, too many animals that did not make it out,
sorry, but
too
the
many
fibrosis
homes
is
reduced
too
to nothing.
advanced.
This
Her lungs
kitten,
won't recover from
against
this
all
damage.
odds,
We
was
have to
still
be realistic
breathing.
about her
Jake
prognosis.
could not just walk
Good
away.
girl, Ember.
He
Keep
carefully lifted the
going.
tiny bobcat, feeling
Look at
how
her
light it
go.
was, how
She's
fragile,
doing great.
and tucked it inside his jacket against
If you
his
can't
chest.
handle it by tomorrow,
The kitten did not
we're
fight.
putting Ember down.
It did not have the strength to fight. Jake could feel the rapid, desperate hammering of its heart through the thin ribcage.
I'm gonna miss you
He
so
keyed his
much.
radio with his free
You be
hand
good,
and
okay?
told his captain he was
Goodbye.
taking a wildlife casualty to the rehabilitation center. The response was terse, reminding him that was not his job. Jake acknowledged the order and kept walking toward his truck anyway. If this story of an impossible bond between a firefighter and a wild animal has touched your heart, please subscribe to Wild Heart Stories. Every new subscriber helps us share more emotional tales that celebrate the extraordinary connections in the animal kingdom. And together, we can build a community dedicated to honoring these beautiful relationships that remind us what truly matters in life. The drive to the Wildfire Prevention and Wildlife Education Center took 43 minutes, and Jake spent every
you
second
are.
of it
It's
terrified
okay
that
now,
the
you're
small
safe.
life pressed against his chest would slip away. He could feel the kitten's labored breathing,
Don't you worry,
could hear
Ember.
the wet rattling sound coming from its
Promise I'll
lungs.
keep you safe.
Smoke inhalation.
Always.
Jake had seen it in humans before, had watched colleagues struggle to breathe after being caught in a flashover. The kitten had been trapped in that inferno for hours, maybe longer, breathing in superheated air thick with toxic particles. Its lungs were likely damaged beyond repair. The thought made Jake press the accelerator harder. Dr. Rachel Foster was in the parking lot when Jake pulled up, already moving toward his truck with a medical kit in hand. Someone from the fire service had called ahead. Rachel was in her late 30s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of steady, calm presence that came from years of dealing with wildlife emergencies. She took one look at Jake's soot-covered face and the small bundle he was cradling, and her expression tightened. They moved quickly into the examination room, without wasting time on pleasantries. Jake laid the kitten on the metal table under bright overhead lights, and for the first time, he could see the full extent of what they were dealing with. The bobcat was female, Rachel confirmed, running expert hands over the small body. Her fur was matted with ash and grime, but underneath, there were no visible burns. That was good. What was not good was the bluish tint to her gums and the way her chest heaved with the effort of pulling in air. Rachel listened with a stethoscope, her face growing more concerned with each passing second. When she finally looked up at Jake, her eyes held a sympathy that made his stomach clench. The kitten's lungs were severely compromised, Rachel explained. The smoke had caused massive inflammation and damage to the delicate tissue. She was getting maybe 60% of the oxygen she needed, possibly less. Without immediate intervention, the kitten would not survive the night. Even with intervention, the chances were not good, maybe 20%. Rachel pulled out an oxygen mask small enough to fit the kitten's face and adjusted the flow. The tiny bobcat did not resist, too weak to do anything but lie there and fight for each breath. Jake should have left then. He had been awake for nearly 20 hours straight, had his shift starting again at dawn, and there was nothing more he could do here. Rachel would handle it. That was her job. But he found himself pulling up a chair next to the examination table instead, one hand resting gently on the kitten's side, feeling the too rapid flutter of her heartbeat beneath his palm. Rachel glanced at him, but said nothing. She had seen this before. This refusal to leave, this desperate need to see it through. They named her Ember that first night. It was Jake's idea, spoken softly around 2 a.m. when the kitten's breathing had become so labored that Rachel had to adjust the oxygen flow twice. Ember, because she had been pulled from the ashes, because she was the small, fragile remnant of something that had been consumed by fire, because despite everything, she still burned with the will to survive. Rachel nodded and wrote the name on the medical chart clipped to the end of the table. 3 times that night, Ember nearly died. Each time, Rachel worked with swift efficiency, adjusting medications, increasing oxygen, doing everything in her power to keep the tiny heart beating. And each time, Jake stayed exactly where he was, his hand on Ember's side, talking to her in low, steady tones. He told her about the forest she would never remember, about the mother who had tried so hard to save her, about how strong she was to still be fighting. He had no idea if she could hear him through the fog of trauma and medication, but he kept talking anyway. When dawn broke through the windows of the clinic, Ember was still breathing. It was labored, it was assisted by machines, but she was alive. Rachel looked at Jake with exhausted eyes and told him he needed to go home, get some sleep. Jake nodded and stood up, every muscle in his body protesting the movement. But before he left, he leaned down close to the oxygen mask and whispered a promise to the small bobcat who had somehow made it through the darkest hours. He would be back. He would not let her fight alone. True to his word, Jake returned that afternoon, still in his fire service uniform, smelling of smoke and sweat. Rachel raised an eyebrow but did not comment. Ember was in a recovery kennel now, slightly more stable, but still requiring constant oxygen support. Jake pulled up the same chair and sat down next to the kennel, resuming the one-sided conversation as if he had never left. He told Ember about the fire, about the progress they were making in containment, about the families who were slowly being allowed to return to what was left of their homes. Rachel worked around him, checking on her other patients, but Jake noticed the small smile that played at the corner of her mouth. The second night was worse than the first. Ember's condition deteriorated rapidly around midnight, and Rachel made the decision to intubate. It was a delicate procedure on such a small animal, and the risk of complications was high. Jake paced the hallway outside the examination room, unable to watch but unable to leave. When Rachel finally emerged an hour later, she looked drained. Ember was back on the oxygen, but Rachel made it clear they were not out of danger, not even close. The next 72 hours would be critical. Jake spent those 72 hours in a strange limbo between the fire line and the clinic. He worked his shifts, fighting the blaze that still refused to be fully contained, then drove straight to the center to sit with Ember. He brought a sleeping bag and crashed on the floor next to her kennel for a few hours each night, waking at every small sound she made. Rachel stopped trying to send him home after the 3rd day. She simply brought him coffee in the mornings and shared whatever food she had on hand. By day 5, something shifted. Ember's breathing, while still assisted, came slightly less desperate. The bluish tint faded from her gums. She opened her eyes for the first time, revealing bright amber irises that were clouded with pain and confusion. And when those eyes found Jake sitting beside her kennel, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the acknowledgement of presence. Jake was there. He had been there through the worst of it, and somehow, on some instinctive level, Ember seemed to understand that. The first time Ember growled at him was on day 8. Rachel called it a good sign. It meant Ember was feeling well enough to be defensive, to remember she was a wild animal, and Jake was a potential threat. But when Jake slowly extended his hand toward the kennel bars, speaking in those same low, steady tones he had used since the beginning, Ember's growl faltered. She was still too weak to do much more than lift her head, but her eyes tracked his movement with sharp intensity. Jake let his fingers rest against the bars, not trying to touch her, just offering his presence. They stayed like that for a long time, predator and human locked in a silent negotiation of trust. The breakthrough came on day 13. Ember had been weaned off the oxygen mask for short periods, though she still needed it for most of the day. Her breathing was improving, slowly but measurably. Rachel had moved her to a larger recovery enclosure, one that allowed her to move around if she felt strong enough. Jake was sitting on the floor outside the enclosure, exhausted from another brutal shift on the fire line. The blaze was finally contained at 87%, but the work was far from over. He'd closed his eyes for just a moment, head resting back against the wall, when he felt something touch his arm through the bars. Jake's eyes snapped open. Ember was standing at the front of the enclosure, one small paw extended through the bars, resting against Jake's forearm. Her face was pressed close to the metal mesh, those amber eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Very slowly, Jake turned his arm so his palm was facing up. Ember withdrew her paw immediately, ears flattening, but after a moment of consideration, she reached out again, this time placing her paw in Jake's open palm. The contact lasted maybe 5 seconds before Ember pulled back and retreated to the far corner of the enclosure, but those 5 seconds changed everything. Rachel, who had witnessed the entire exchange from across the room, met Jake's eyes and nodded slowly. They had turned a corner. From that day forward, the bond between Jake and Ember grew in small, incremental ways. She allowed him to be closer to the enclosure without showing signs of stress. She watched for him, ears perking up when she heard his voice in the hallway. When Rachel needed to perform examinations or administer medication, Ember would only cooperate if Jake was present, his steady presence somehow grounding her through the discomfort and fear. It was, Rachel told him, both remarkable and concerning. Remarkable because wild animals rarely formed attachments this strong with humans. Concerning because it would make Ember's eventual release back into the wild much more complicated. But release was still months away, if it happened at all. As the weeks turned into a month, then 6 weeks, Rachel ran more tests on Ember's respiratory function. The results were not what anyone had hoped for. The smoke damage had been too severe, too extensive. Ember's lungs had healed as much as they were going to heal, but they would never function at full capacity. She had maybe 60% of normal lung function, perhaps slightly less. It meant she could breathe on her own, could live a relatively normal life in captivity, but survival in the wild would be nearly impossible. Bobcats hunted through ambush and short bursts of speed. Ember could manage neither. She would tire too quickly, would be unable to catch the prey she needed to survive. And winter in Montana was brutal. An animal that could not hunt efficiently would not make it through the cold months. Jake was there when Rachel explained this to the Wildlife Board representative who had come to assess Ember's case. He watched Ember in her enclosure, now 10 weeks old and looking almost healthy if you did not know what to watch for. The way she would stop playing after just a minute or two, sides heaving as she fought to catch her breath. The way she avoided any sustained activity, preferring to conserve her energy. She was beautiful, fierce in her own way, but she would never be able to return to the wild. The representative proposed a solution. The Wildfire Prevention and Wildlife Education Center ran educational programs in schools and community centers throughout Montana. They taught about fire safety, about the importance of prevention, about the devastating impact wildfires had on wildlife. Ember could become part of that program, an ambassador animal, living proof of what smoke and flames could do. She would have a purpose, would spend her life teaching others about the dangers that had nearly killed her. It was not freedom, but it was a life, a good life, with proper care and respect for her nature as a wild animal. Jake visited Ember every day for the next month as she continued to recover and grow stronger within her limitations. He was there for her training sessions as Rachel worked with professional animal handlers to help Ember adjust to the special vest she would wear during educational presentations. He was there when Ember took her first supervised walk outside the clinic, watching her breathe in the fresh air she had nearly been denied forever. He was there when Ember climbed her first tree in the outdoor enclosure, making it halfway up before her breathing became too labored and she had to descend. It was more than enough. She was alive. She had fought through the impossible and survived. But then, 3 months after pulling Ember from the ashes, Jake received the phone call that would change everything. His captain was direct and to the point. Jake had been selected for a promotion opportunity in Portland, Oregon. It was a significant step up in his career, a chance to lead his own crew, to make a real difference in wildfire management at a regional level. The position would start in 3 weeks. Jake needed to give his answer within 72 hours. 3 weeks. Jake sat in his truck outside the Wildlife Center, phone still in his hand, and felt the weight of the decision crushing down on him. This promotion was everything he had been working toward for 6 years. It was the kind of opportunity that did not come around twice. But it also meant leaving Montana, leaving the forest he knew like the back of his hand, leaving Ember, who still had months of rehabilitation ahead of her before she would be ready for her role as an educational ambassador. That evening, Jake sat outside Ember's enclosure longer than usual. She was curled up in her favorite corner, drowsy but watching him with those sharp amber eyes. At 4 months old, she was already showing the elegant lines and powerful build of an adult bobcat, though she was still far from fully grown. Jake told her about the promotion, speaking out loud the conflict that was tearing him apart inside. Ember listened the way she always did, head tilted slightly, ears forward. When Jake finally fell silent, she stood up and walked over to the enclosure door, pressing her face against the mesh. Jake extended his hand, and Ember rubbed her cheek against his fingers, scent marking him in the way bobcats claimed what was theirs. Rachel found him there an hour later. She sat down beside him without a word, and they watched Ember together in comfortable silence. Finally, Jake asked the question he was afraid to voice. If he took the promotion, would Ember be okay? Would she forget? Rachel was quiet for a long moment before answering. Ember would be okay, she said. She was strong, resilient, and she had a future here that would give her life meaning. As for forgetting, Rachel admitted she did not know. Wild animals had remarkable memories, but they also adapted to new circumstances. If Jake left, Ember would bond with her handlers, would learn to trust others. It was the best anyone could hope for. But Jake could hear what Rachel was not saying, that Ember had bonded with him in a way that went beyond normal animal-handler relationships, that leaving would impact her, at least for a while, that some part of her would remember, even if she eventually moved forward. The question was whether Jake could live with that, whether his career was worth the cost of walking away from the small life he had saved from the ashes. Jake gave his answer to his captain 72 hours later. He was taking the promotion. It was the hardest decision he had ever made, and he questioned it every single day of the 3 weeks he had left in Montana. But he also knew it was the right decision. He could not put his entire life on hold for a bobcat, no matter how much he cared about her. Ember had a future here, a purpose, a team of people who would care for her. Jake needed to trust that would be enough. The last week was brutal. Jake spent every free moment at the Wildlife Center, trying to somehow prepare Ember for his absence, even though he knew she could not possibly understand what was coming. Rachel assured him Ember would adjust, that animals were remarkably adaptable, but Jake could see the concern in her eyes. On his final day, Jake brought Ember her favorite treat, fresh quail that Rachel had approved. He sat with her for 3 hours, just being present, memorizing every detail of her face, the pattern of spots on her coat, the way her ears twitched when she was content. When it was time to leave, Jake stood up and pressed his hand against the enclosure one last time. Ember immediately moved to meet him, rubbing against the mesh with a soft chirping sound that bobcats made when greeting someone they trusted. Jake felt his throat tighten. He whispered goodbye, promised her she would have a good life, and turned to walk away before his resolve could crumble. He made it to the parking lot before the tears came. Rachel followed him out and handed him a small folder. Inside were progress photos of Ember, medical records, and a handwritten note promising to send updates every week. Jake nodded his thanks, not trusting himself to speak. He got in his truck and drove away from the Wildlife Center without looking back. Behind him, inside the building, Ember paced the perimeter of her enclosure for the next 2 hours, searching for the person who had been her constant presence for the past 4 months. When Jake did not return, she eventually settled in her favorite corner, head resting on her paws, eyes fixed on the door where he had disappeared. She would wait there until the handlers gently coaxed her to eat her evening meal, but for those 2 hours, she waited for someone who was already 300 miles away, heading toward a new life that did not include her. The first email from Rachel arrived 4 days after Jake started his new position in Portland. It contained 3 photos of Ember and a brief update on her progress. She was eating well, Rachel wrote, though she had been listless for the first 48 hours after Jake left. The handlers were working with her daily, building trust, preparing her for her eventual role in the education program. Jake read the email twice, studied the photos until he had memorized every pixel, then filed it away in a folder on his laptop. He promised himself he would check regularly. The second email came a week later. Ember was responding better to the handlers, showing more energy during training sessions. She had successfully worn her educational vest for a full hour without distress. She was going to be ready sooner than expected. Jake felt a surge of pride mixed with something darker he did not want to examine too closely. He replied with a brief congratulations and a question about her respiratory function. Rachel answered promptly with detailed medical data that showed Ember's lung capacity had stabilized at 58%, not ideal, but sufficient for the controlled activities she would be doing. By the 3rd month, the emails had settled into a weekly rhythm. Rachel would send updates every Sunday evening, and Jake would read them Monday morning before his shift. Ember was thriving in her role, Rachel reported. She had done her first school presentation at a local elementary school, and the children had been mesmerized. Ember had a natural stage presence, moving through her routine with calm confidence that belied her wild nature. The educational program was already receiving requests for more appearances. Jake threw himself into his new position with the same intensity he had brought to fighting the Flathead fire. He built his crew from the ground up, implementing new strategies for wildfire prevention and response. Portland's fire season was different from Montana's, wetter and more unpredictable, but Jake adapted quickly. His team respected him, trusted his judgment in the field. He was good at this job, better than he had expected to be. On the hard days, when the smoke got thick and the flames jumped fire breaks, he would think about a small bobcat kitten fighting for air in the ashes, and it reminded him why this work mattered. 6 months after leaving Montana, Jake opened his laptop on a Sunday evening and found no email from Rachel. He told himself she had probably just been busy, that there was nothing to worry about, but Monday morning brought no email either. By Wednesday, Jake broke down and sent a message asking if everything was okay. Rachel replied within an hour, apologetic and rushed. She had been swamped with administrative work and had fallen behind on her updates. Ember was fine, better than fine, actually. She had given presentations to over 300 students in the past month alone. The program was growing faster than anyone had anticipated. Jake read the email and felt something shift inside him. Ember did not need his weekly check-ins. She had moved on, found her purpose, was thriving without him. It was exactly what he had hoped for when he made the decision to leave. So why did it feel like a small death? He typed out a response, thanking her for the update, then sat staring at the screen for 10 minutes before hitting send. That night, for the first time since arriving in Portland, Jake allowed himself to fully feel the grief he had been holding at bay. He had saved Ember's life, but he had also given her up. Both things could be true at the same time. The emails continued, though less frequently now, once every 2 weeks, then once a month. Rachel's updates became shorter, more focused on statistics and program growth than on Ember's personal well-being. Jake told himself that was appropriate. He was not Ember's handler, was not part of her daily life anymore. He was just the person who had pulled her from the fire, had seen her through those critical first months. That chapter was over. But he kept every email, every photo, filed away in that folder he almost never opened anymore. A year after leaving Montana, Jake was promoted again, Assistant Chief of Wildfire Operations for the entire Portland region. It was a desk job as much as a field position, but it came with real authority to make changes, to shape policy, to save lives on a larger scale. He accepted without hesitation. That same week, he received an email from Rachel with a subject line, 1-year anniversary. Inside was a photo of Ember, now fully grown and magnificent, standing on a presentation platform at a high school with her handler beside her. The caption read, "Ember has now taught over 5,000 students about wildfire safety and prevention. She is extraordinary." Jake looked at the photo for a long time, at the confident set of Ember's shoulders, the calm alertness in her eyes. She looked nothing like the dying kitten he had pulled from the ashes. She looked like exactly what she was supposed to be. Jake composed a response, congratulating Rachel and the entire team on the program's success. He hit send and then did something he had been avoiding for months. He unsubscribed from Rachel's mailing list. It was not cruel, he told himself. It was necessary. Every email, every photo, every update was a reminder of what he had walked away from. He needed to move forward, and he could not do that while constantly looking back toward Montana. Ember had her life, and Jake had his. That was how it needed to be. 2 years became 3. He barely thought about Ember anymore, or at least that was what he told himself. When he did think of her, it was with the distant fondness of a memory that no longer carried sharp edges. He dated casually, focused on his career, built a life in Portland that had nothing to do with a wildlife center in Montana or a bobcat who had once trusted him completely. He was happy, or something close enough to happiness that he did not examine it too carefully. 3 years became 5. Jake was offered a position as Chief of Operations, the youngest person to ever hold that title in Portland's history. He accepted and celebrated with his team at a bar downtown, surrounded by people who respected him, colleagues who had become friends. When he got home that night, slightly drunk and riding the high of achievement, he did something he had not done in over 3 years. He opened his laptop and navigated to that old folder where Rachel's emails were stored. There were 47 messages, spanning that first year, a window into Ember's progress and growth. Jake read through them all, one after another, and felt something crack open inside his chest that he had thought was fully healed. The next morning, nursing a hangover and feeling foolish, Jake typed Rachel's email address into a new message. He wrote and deleted 3 different drafts before finally settling on something simple. He was just checking in, he wrote, wondering how Ember was doing, how the education program was going. He hit send before he could second-guess himself and then tried not to obsessively check his inbox for a response. Rachel's reply came 2 days later. Her tone was warm but professional, the way you would address an old colleague you had not spoken to in years. Ember was thriving, she wrote. The program had expanded to cover 6 counties now, and Ember was their star educator. She had been featured in a regional magazine article about innovative wildfire prevention programs. Rachel attached the article, and Jake downloaded it immediately. The photo showed Ember at 7 years old, poised and powerful, standing beside her primary handler at a community event. The article detailed how many lives the education program potentially saved by teaching people about fire safety and the devastating impact of wildfires on wildlife. Ember was described as a survivor, a symbol of resilience, a living reminder of what was at stake. Jake read the article 3 times. He felt pride, certainly, but also something more complicated. Ember had become exactly what she was meant to be. She had found her purpose, was making a real difference in the world. She did not need him, had not needed him for a long time. That should have brought closure, should have allowed Jake to move forward without the weight of old guilt. Instead, it left him feeling oddly hollow. He did not email Rachel again after that. There was nothing left to say. Year 6 brought a new challenge when a massive wildfire complex tore through Oregon, the worst in the state's recorded history. Jake's team worked around the clock for 31 days straight, coordinating resources across multiple jurisdictions, making life-or-death decisions about evacuations and fire breaks. They saved countless homes and an entire town that had been on the brink of destruction. Jake was exhausted, smoke-damaged, and running on pure adrenaline and coffee, but they had done it. When it was finally over, when the last hotspot had been extinguished and his team could finally stand down, Jake found himself sitting in his truck in the parking lot of the operations center, unable to drive home. His hands were shaking, and there was an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with smoke inhalation. He had saved so many lives during that fire, had made decisions that kept families safe, protected communities, preserved forests. But all he could think about was a single bobcat kitten pulled from the ashes 6 years ago. All he could wonder was whether Ember still remembered him, or if he had become just another human in the parade of handlers and caretakers who had shaped her life. The question felt absurd, self-indulgent, but it would not leave him alone. Year 7 arrived with a quiet email from Rachel that Jake almost deleted without reading. It had been over a year since their last communication, and he had trained himself not to look backward anymore. But something made him click on the message. Rachel's words were careful, almost tentative. She did not know if Jake still checked this email address, she wrote, or if he would even care to know. But there had been some changes in Ember's behavior over the past 6 months that concerned her. Nothing medically wrong, Rachel was quick to clarify. Ember's health was good, her respiratory function stable. But she had become less engaged during educational presentations, going through the motions, but without her usual spark. More concerning, she had developed a behavior Rachel had never seen before. Whenever firefighters visited the center for training sessions or tours, Ember would become intensely focused on them. She would approach the barriers of her demonstration area, would watch them with an alertness that went beyond normal curiosity. And more than once, Rachel had seen Ember scent the air around visiting firefighters, searching for something she could not find. Rachel's email ended with a simple statement that hit Jake like a physical blow. She thought Ember was looking for him. After 7 years, after all the time and distance and new relationships, some part of Ember still remembered, still searched, still waited for a familiar scent that never came. Jake sat at his desk for 20 minutes after reading that email, staring at the screen without moving. He could ignore this, should ignore this. Ember had a good life, important work, people who cared for her. Jake showing up after all this time would only confuse her, would disrupt the stability she had found. He had made his choice 7 years ago, and revisiting it now served no purpose. He typed out a response, thanking Rachel for the update, but explaining that he thought it was best if he stayed away. He wrote that Ember had clearly moved on and adjusted to her life without him, and his reappearance might do more harm than good. He emphasized how proud he was of everything Ember had achieved and how grateful he was to Rachel for giving her such a meaningful purpose. It was a careful, measured response that said all the right things. Jake read it over twice, cursor hovering over the send button. Then he deleted the entire message and closed his laptop. He did not know what to do. For 7 years, he had convinced himself that leaving had been the right decision, that his career mattered, that Ember would be fine without him, that wild animals did not form lasting attachments the way humans did. But Rachel's email had shattered all those comfortable lies. Ember remembered. After all this time, through all the changes and growth and new experiences, some part of her still carried the memory of the person who had saved her from the ashes. The question was whether Jake had the courage to face what he had left behind. 2 months passed. Jake did not respond to Rachel's email, and she did not follow up. He threw himself into work with renewed intensity, taking on extra projects, volunteering for the hardest assignments, anything to avoid the question that haunted him during quiet moments. His colleagues noticed the change, asked if everything was okay. Jake assured them it was, that he was just focused on an important initiative. They seemed to accept that explanation, or at least pretended to. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late spring, Jake received an email that changed everything. It was not from Rachel this time, but from the Montana Wildfire Services Association. They were organizing a commemoration event to mark the 10-year anniversary of the Flathead National Forest Fire, the largest wildfire in Montana's history until that point. The event would honor the firefighters who had fought the blaze, remember the communities affected, and showcase the recovery and prevention efforts that had been implemented since. It would take place at the main fire station in the region where Jake had been stationed during the fire. And as part of the event, the Wildfire Prevention and Wildlife Education Center would be giving a special presentation featuring Ember, the bobcat who had survived the inferno and now dedicated her life to teaching others about fire safety. The email included a personal note from Jake's former captain. They wanted Jake there. He had been one of the key personnel during that fire, had worked longer hours than anyone else on the crew. His presence at the commemoration would mean something to the community, to the team, to everyone who had fought alongside him. The captain did not mention Ember specifically, but Jake knew he must have been aware of the connection. Montana's fire service was a tight-knit community. Stories traveled. Jake read the email 3 times. The event was scheduled for 8 weeks from now. That gave him plenty of time to come up with an excuse, to politely decline, to maintain the distance he had worked so hard to establish. Every rational part of his brain told him to stay away. Seeing Ember again after all this time would accomplish nothing. It would not change the past, would not undo the decision he had made. It might even hurt her, might disrupt the equilibrium she had found. But Jake remembered Rachel's words. Ember searching the faces of visiting firefighters, Ember scenting the air, looking for something she could not find, Ember going through the motions of her important work, but missing some spark that used to define her. And he remembered his own words, whispered to a dying kitten in a clinic at 2 a.m. "I will be back. I will not let you fight alone." He had broken that promise, had chosen his career over keeping his word to a wild animal who had trusted him. For 7 years, he had told himself it was the right choice, the mature choice, the only choice that made sense. But sitting in his office in Portland, reading about a commemoration event 8 weeks away, Jake finally admitted the truth to himself. He had been running, from guilt, from grief, from the weight of a bond that had meant more to him than he had been willing to acknowledge. Jake pulled up a response to the Montana Wildfire Services Association. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he typed 4 words, "I will be there." He hit send and immediately felt his heart rate spike. What had he just agreed to? What was he expecting to happen? Ember probably would not even remember him after 8 years. Animals did not hold grudges or carry memories the way humans did. He was setting himself up for disappointment, for the confirmation that he had built up this connection into something it had never really been. But somewhere deeper, beneath the layer of rational doubt, Jake felt something else, a pull toward Montana, toward a fire station, toward a bobcat who might or might not still carry the scent memory of the person who had saved her life. He had 8 weeks to prepare himself for whatever he would find there, 8 weeks to accept that seeing Ember again might bring closure, or it might break something inside him that had never fully healed. Jake closed his laptop and sat in the silence of his office, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. In 8 weeks, he would return to Montana. He would stand in front of a crowd of colleagues and community members, and he would see Ember again, the small life he had pulled from the ashes, the wild animal who had trusted him once upon a time. Whatever happened after that, he would finally know whether the bond he had carried for 8 years had been real or just a story he had told himself to make the leaving easier. The countdown had begun. 8 weeks until Jake Mitchell faced the past he had been running from. 8 weeks until Ember got the chance to search one more crowd of strangers for a familiar scent. 8 weeks until 2 lives that had diverged in different directions would converge again in front of witnesses who had no idea they were about to see something impossible. The drive from Portland to Montana took 14 hours, and Jake made it in one straight shot. He left at 4 in the morning on the day before the commemoration event, telling himself he needed the extra time to mentally prepare. The truth was he could not sleep anyway, had been lying awake for hours staring at the ceiling, wondering what the hell he was doing. The landscape changed as he drove east, from the wet, green forests of Oregon to the dramatic peaks and valleys of Montana. He had forgotten how big the sky was here, how it seemed to stretch forever in all directions. Or maybe he had just been trying to forget. Jake checked into a small hotel on the outskirts of town around 6 in the evening. The commemoration event was scheduled for 10 the next morning at the regional fire station. He had 12 hours to get his head right, to figure out what he hoped to accomplish by being here. He ordered room service, ate without tasting the food, and spent the evening pacing the small room like a caged animal. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ember as she had been 8 years ago, a tiny, dying kitten fighting for every breath, and then he saw her as she had looked in that magazine photo Rachel had sent. Powerful, confident, completely transformed. Which version would he see tomorrow? And more importantly, would she recognize him? Sleep came in fitful bursts. Jake woke at dawn, feeling like he had not slept at all. He showered, dressed in his Portland Fire Service uniform as requested by the event organizers, and stared at himself in the mirror. At 36, he looked older than he felt. Lines around his eyes from years of squinting through smoke, silver starting to show at his temples. He was not the same person who had left Montana 8 years ago. How could he expect Ember to recognize someone who had changed so much? The drive to the fire station took 20 minutes. Jake arrived an hour early, but the parking lot was already half full. He recognized some of the faces, former colleagues who greeted him with genuine warmth and handshakes that turned into brief hugs. They wanted to know about Portland, about his career, about whether he missed Montana. Jake answered on autopilot, his attention divided. A large tent had been set up behind the fire station, and he could see people moving around inside, setting up equipment and displays. Somewhere in that controlled chaos was Ember and her handler, preparing for the demonstration that would be the centerpiece of the event. Jake found a seat near the back of the assembled chairs, ignoring the reserved seating in the front rows for honored guests and VIPs. He told the event coordinator he preferred to keep a low profile, that this day should be about the community and the firefighters who had fought the blaze, not about him. The coordinator looked puzzled, but did not push. Jake settled into his seat and tried to control the nervous energy that made his hands shake slightly. He folded them in his lap and focused on breathing steadily, the way he had taught himself to do before entering a dangerous fire zone. The ceremony began with speeches from local officials and fire service leadership. They talked about the Flathead fire in terms of statistics and impact. 40,000 acres burned, 16 homes destroyed, 3 firefighters injured, millions of dollars in damage. But also, they talked about resilience, about how the community had come together, how prevention efforts had improved, how the education programs implemented since the fire had made a measurable difference in reducing fire risk. Jake listened with half his attention, the other half focused on the tent behind the speaker's platform where he knew Ember was waiting. After 40 minutes of speeches, the event coordinator took the microphone and announced the special presentation everyone had been waiting for. The Wildfire Prevention and Wildlife Education Center would now share the story of Ember, a survivor of the Flathead fire who had dedicated her life to teaching others about wildfire safety. The crowd applauded as Rachel Foster walked onto the platform, followed by a younger woman Jake did not recognize, the handler, presumably, and between them, moving with the controlled grace of a wild predator in an unfamiliar environment, was Ember. Jake stopped breathing. 8 years fell away in an instant. She was magnificent, fully grown now, probably 25 pounds of lean muscle and elegant lines. Her tawny coat was marked with the distinctive spots and stripes that made bobcats such striking animals. She wore a red educational vest that identified her as a working ambassador animal, but it was her face that arrested Jake's attention. Those same amber eyes, sharper now and more alert but unmistakably hers. The set of her ears, the way she held her head, the particular pattern of markings around her muzzle. It was Ember, transformed but still somehow exactly who she had always been. Rachel began the presentation by telling Ember's story. She did not mention Jake by name, simply referred to him as one of the firefighters who discovered her. She described the severity of Ember's smoke inhalation, the long recovery, the decision to make her an educational ambassador when it became clear she could not survive in the wild. The crowd listened in rapt attention. Many of them were seeing Ember for the first time, and there was something undeniably powerful about watching a wild bobcat stand calmly on a presentation platform, living proof of the devastation wildfires could cause. Ember performed her demonstration with practiced ease. She walked the length of the platform, showing the crowd her calm demeanor despite being surrounded by hundreds of people. Her handler demonstrated the vest and explained how it helped Ember stay comfortable during presentations. Rachel talked about the importance of wildfire prevention, about how Ember had reached over 15,000 students and community members in the past 8 years with her message of fire safety. The statistics were impressive, but Jake barely heard them. He was watching Ember, looking for any sign that she was unhappy or stressed, but she seemed comfortable, even content. This was her job, her purpose, and she did it well. Then Rachel invited questions from the audience. Several children raised their hands, asking about what Ember ate, whether she liked being around people, if she remembered the fire. Rachel answered patiently, explaining that bobcats were obligate carnivores, that Ember tolerated people but did not seek affection the way domestic cats did, that no one could know for certain what Ember remembered, but her behavior suggested she carried some awareness of her traumatic past. More hands went up, more questions about Ember's daily life and work. The presentation was running long, but no one seemed to mind. Ember sat patiently on her platform, occasionally turning her head to scan the crowd with those alert amber eyes. Jake had been so focused on Ember that he did not realize he had been holding his breath until his lungs started to burn. He exhaled slowly, trying to stay relaxed, trying not to draw attention to himself. But the movement must have created some small shift in air current, because suddenly Ember's head turned sharply in his direction. Her ears pricked forward, and her entire body went still in a way that made Rachel pause mid-sentence. The handler noticed immediately and put a gentle hand on Ember's back, trying to redirect her attention back to the presentation. But Ember was not interested in redirection. She was staring at the back section of the crowd with an intensity that made several people turn to look at what had captured her attention. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. Ember could not possibly send him from that distance, not with hundreds of people between them, not after 8 years. But her posture had changed completely. The calm, practiced demeanor of a working ambassador animal was gone, replaced by something wild and alert. She took a step toward the edge of the platform, and the handler gently restrained her, speaking in low, soothing tones. Rachel tried to continue the presentation, but Ember was not listening. She was searching the crowd, head moving in small increments as she tested the air, trying to isolate whatever scent had caught her attention. People started to murmur. This was not part of the demonstration. Several audience members in the front rows looked concerned, unsure if they should be worried about a wild bobcat who was suddenly acting unpredictable. Rachel made the decision to end the presentation early, thanking everyone for their attention and beginning to guide Ember back toward the tent. But Ember resisted, pulling against her handler's gentle guidance, still scanning the crowd with desperate intensity. Jake knew he should stay seated, should let this moment pass, should allow the handlers to get Ember away from the crowd and back into her safe, controlled environment. But watching her search for something she could not find, watching the confusion and almost frantic quality of her movement, broke something inside him that had been barely holding together. Before he fully realized what he was doing, Jake stood up. The movement drew Ember's attention like a magnet. Her head swiveled toward the back of the crowd, locking onto Jake's position. For a moment, everything went still. Jake could see the exact instant recognition hit. Ember's entire body language changed, ears pushed forward, mouth slightly open as she pulled in air, confirming what her eyes were telling her. Then she made a sound Jake had never heard from her before, a kind of chirping, trilling call that held notes of excitement and disbelief and desperate joy all mixed together. Rachel turned to see what had captured Ember's attention and froze when she saw Jake standing in the back row. Her eyes went wide with understanding. The handler tried to maintain her grip on Ember's vest, but the bobcat was no longer listening to any commands. With a strength that surprised everyone, Ember pulled free and launched herself off the platform, not running away from the crowd, but toward Jake. The audience erupted in startled exclamations. Several people jumped up from their chairs, unsure whether they should be fleeing from a loose, wild animal. But Ember ignored all of them. She moved through the crowd with single-minded purpose, weaving between chairs and people with the fluid grace of a predator who knew exactly where she needed to be. Her eyes never left Jake. Within seconds that felt like hours, she had crossed the distance between the platform and the back rows. Jake dropped to his knees without thinking, arms opening automatically. Ember did not slow down. She launched herself at him with enough force to knock him backward. And then she was there, in his arms, rubbing her face against his neck and chest with frantic intensity. The trilling sound continued, interspersed with small chuffing noises that bobcats made when greeting family members. She scent-marked him obsessively, rubbing her cheeks and the sides of her mouth against his uniform, his hands, his face, claiming him all over again after 8 years of absence. Jake wrapped his arms around her and felt tears streaming down his face before he could stop them. She remembered. After everything, after all the time and distance and new experiences, Ember remembered. She knew his scent, recognized his presence, and had broken away from her training and handlers to get to him. He buried his face in her fur, breathing in the wild scent of her, feeling the solid warmth of her body, the rapid beating of her heart. She was real. This was real. He had not made it up or built it into something it was not. The bond they had formed 8 years ago had survived everything that had tried to break it. The clearing of a throat made Jake look up. Rachel was standing a few feet away, tears in her own eyes, a complicated expression on her face. Behind her, the crowd had gone completely silent. Every person in attendance was watching this impossible reunion, witnessing something they would tell their grandchildren about: a wild bobcat, trained and professional, abandoning protocol to greet someone she had not seen in 8 years. It should not have been possible. Wild animals did not form attachments like this. They adapted, moved on, found new bonds. But Ember was proving that sometimes the rules did not apply, that sometimes a connection went deep enough that time became irrelevant. Jake spent the next 2 hours with Ember in a quiet area behind the fire station, with Rachel and the handlers supervising from a respectful distance. Ember did not leave his side, constantly touching him, checking to make sure he was still there. When Jake tried to stand and move away, Ember followed immediately, pressing against his legs the way a domestic cat might. Her respiratory limitations were evident. After the explosive sprint across the crowd and the sustained excitement of the reunion, Ember was breathing harder than she should have been. She needed to rest frequently, lying down next to Jake and putting her head on his knee while she recovered her breath. But even exhausted, she would not let him out of her sight. Rachel eventually sat down next to Jake and told him everything, how Ember had never fully bonded with her subsequent handlers the way she had bonded with Jake, how she did her work professionally and well but always with a kind of distance that suggested she was holding part of herself back. How in the past year that distance had become more pronounced, and Ember had developed the searching behavior Rachel had mentioned in her email. She had been looking for Jake for 8 years. On some level, she had been waiting for him to come back. Jake listened and felt the full weight of what he had done when he left. He had told himself Ember would be fine, would adapt, would forget. And in many ways, she had been fine. She had an important job, made a real difference in the world, lived a comfortable life with people who cared for her. But she had never stopped carrying the absence of the person who had saved her, who had been her constant presence through the worst months of her life. Jake had moved on, built a career, convinced himself the bond had been temporary. But for Ember, it had been permanent, a foundation that nothing else had quite been able to replace. As the sun began to set, Jake knew he had to make a decision. He could not stay in Montana. His life was in Portland, his career, his team, everything he had built over the past 8 years. But he also could not walk away from Ember again, not after seeing how she had reacted to his presence, not after understanding the depth of what she had carried all these years. He asked Rachel what she thought, what would be best for Ember. Rachel was quiet for a long time before answering. Ember needed consistency, Rachel finally said. Routine, familiar handlers, the structure of her educational work. What she did not need was someone who would come back into her life only to disappear again. Rachel said it gently, but Jake heard the warning clearly. If he could not commit to being a permanent part of Ember's life, it would be kinder to make this a final goodbye, to let Ember have closure and move forward. As cruel as that sounded, it might be the most loving thing Jake could do. But Rachel also acknowledged that what had happened today changed things. Ember had shown beyond any doubt that she remembered that Jake was not just another human to her. And maybe, Rachel suggested carefully, there was a middle path. Jake could not stay in Montana, but he could visit, regularly, consistently enough that Ember would know he had not abandoned her again, that the bond they shared was still honored, even if they could not be together every day. It would not erase the past 8 years of absence, but it might give Ember something to hold on to going forward. Jake spent the night in Montana, sleeping in the same hotel room where he had paced nervously the night before. But this time, exhaustion won out over anxiety, and he slept deeply for the first time in weeks. When he woke, he knew what he needed to do. He drove to the wildlife center and found Rachel in her office. He told her his decision. He would visit Ember 4 times a year, marking the seasons, once in spring, once in summer, once in fall, once in winter. He would coordinate with Rachel to make sure the visits fit with Ember's schedule and did not disrupt her work, but he would be consistent. He would keep his promise this time. He would not let Ember fight alone. Rachel smiled, the first truly relaxed smile Jake had seen from her since arriving. That would work, she said. They could make that work. And maybe, over time, the visits could become part of Ember's routine, something she could anticipate and rely on. It was not perfect, but it was honest. It acknowledged the bond without pretending Jake could be someone he was not. Jake's final visit with Ember before returning to Portland was different from the emotional chaos of the reunion. He sat with her in one of the outdoor enclosures, just being present the way he had 8 years ago when she was recovering. Ember was calmer now, having processed the shock of his reappearance. She stayed close, occasionally rubbing against him or putting her paw on his knee, but she was not frantic. She seemed to understand, on whatever level wild animals understood such things, that this was not goodbye forever, that Jake would return, that she did not have to cling to this moment because there would be others. When it was time to leave, Jake stood and pressed his forehead gently against Ember's. She made that small chirping sound again, but quieter this time, almost content. He promised her he would be back in 3 months, at the start of summer. He would make this drive again and again, for as long as Ember needed him to. It was not what he had planned when he pulled a dying kitten from the ashes all those years ago, but some bonds transcended planning, transcended logic, transcended even the best intentions to move forward and let go. The drive back to Portland felt different than the drive to Montana had. Jake was not running this time, was not trying to escape or deny or convince himself the past did not matter. He was simply holding space for a truth that he finally accepted. He had saved Ember's life, but she had changed his in ways he was still discovering. She had taught him that some connections survived everything, that love did not always look the way you expected it to, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was acknowledge a bond, even when it was inconvenient or painful or complicated. 3 months later, Jake made the drive again. Ember was waiting for him, and though the reunion was less dramatic than the first one, it was no less meaningful. They spent 3 days together, with Jake volunteering at the Wildlife Center and helping with presentations. He watched Ember teach children about fire safety, saw the impact she had on young minds, understood that her purpose was real and important. She was not just surviving, she was thriving in the way that mattered most, by making the world better through her presence in it. The seasonal visits became a cornerstone of Jake's life. His team in Portland learned to work around his quarterly trips to Montana. He never explained in detail why those trips were non-negotiable, but his colleagues respected the boundary. Jake's career continued to flourish, but it no longer consumed him the way it once had. He had found balance, had learned that success meant different things at different times. Sometimes it meant saving lives on a massive scale through policy and leadership. And sometimes it meant keeping a promise to a wild animal who trusted you, even when you did not deserve that trust. 5 years after the reunion, Jake stood in the outdoor enclosure, watching Ember teach a group of elementary school students about the dangers of wildfires. She was 13 now, middle-aged for a bobcat, and her movements had slowed slightly. Her respiratory limitations were more apparent than they had been when she was younger, but she still had that presence, that calm authority that made people listen. The children watched her with wide eyes, absorbing lessons about fire safety that might save their lives someday. After the presentation ended and the children had been led away by their teachers, Ember came and sat next to Jake on the bench where he always waited. He scratched behind her ears in the way she had always loved, and she leaned into the touch with a rumbling purr that was rare for bobcats, but that Ember had never hesitated to share with him. Rachel joined them, settling on Jake's other side with a satisfied sigh. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the three of them watching the late afternoon sun paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and amber. Finally, Rachel spoke. She told Jake that the education program had now reached over 40,000 people, that fire-related injuries in the region had dropped by 23% since the program began, that Ember had become a symbol of resilience and prevention that had inspired similar programs in 3 other states. The impact was measurable, significant, undeniable. Jake nodded, taking it in, feeling the weight of what Ember's life had meant. She could not survive in the wild, would never know the freedom of hunting her own prey or raising cubs or claiming territory. But she had done something perhaps more important. She had turned her trauma into purpose, her survival into a lesson that saved lives. And in doing that, she had proven that sometimes the path forward was not about returning to what you were before, but about becoming something new that honored both the pain and the possibility. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Jake thought about the choice he had made 13 years ago, to pull a dying kitten from the ashes. He had broken protocol, had risked his career, had acted on instinct rather than policy. And then he had made another choice 8 years ago, to leave, to pursue his ambitions, to trust that Ember would find her way without him. Both choices had been right in their own way, even though they had also been painful. Life was not about perfect decisions. It was about showing up, doing your best, and honoring the connections that mattered, even when they challenged you to grow in uncomfortable directions. Ember shifted against Jake's leg, settling more comfortably, her breathing steady and calm. She had fought her way back from the edge of death, had adapted to limitations that would have defeated many animals, had found purpose in a life she never would have chosen for herself. And through it all, she had carried the memory of the person who saved her, had waited 8 years for him to remember that some promises could not be broken without cost. Jake had finally learned the lesson Ember had been trying to teach him all along, that love did not mean possession, that caring sometimes meant leaving, but that true bonds survived even the longest separations. The fire that should have killed Ember had instead forged something unbreakable between 2 beings who should never have connected at all. As darkness fell over Montana, Jake stayed where he was, Ember warm against his side, grateful for the small life that had taught him the most important truths about his own.